We'll go ahead and get started this morning. I'm starting us off a little late. I apologize for that. We're going to continue the study of James, and today we're going to be looking at the third chapter, which it's a perplexing beginning because a lot of people take a look at this first verse, and it has different meanings to different people, and I think that when we see what James actually meant from it, it might change some perspective. I've even been told that there's some out there that have chosen not to be teachers because of this first verse, and I think that's definitely a misapplication of what this is saying, but it's definitely a very interesting study that we're going to start off with. But I want to start off by asking, who are the influences in your life? Who have influenced you in the various things that you've done? Invariably, in my life, it was either a coach or a teacher. Now, I don't know what you think of, what that visual of is when you think or see the word teacher, but I would hope that, like me, in the little school right across the 4th Street there, which was called Northeast, not Rhodes, but Northeast, I can still tell you all the teachers that I had there, and I can tell you all the really good experiences that I had, like this, and then I can also tell you some bad experiences. But for the most part, this is a visual that would come to mind when thinking of teachers. Now, I also have a second visual when I think of teachers, because in law school, I had a gentleman named Bernard Schwartz. Now, Bernard Schwartz was, he came to TU. He was like the crown jewel of TU's law school at that time. He was a somebody. He wrote the book on constitutional law. In fact, he had a seat at the Supreme Court anytime he wanted to visit, anytime he wanted to watch what was going on at the court. He had a reserved spot. He was a somebody. And he wrote the books, and I say books because he wrote the book and the treatise on administrative law, and that's what I had him for. And I don't know, these are fun books, but we would go into class and he would tell the student to turn to page such and such, go down to this such and such paragraph and start at the whatever word. And after you read the first sentence, which he would state from memory, then start from there. And he was a very impressive man, but he was also a very scary man. And this is what I see when I think of teachers now. And I've had nightmares that are made from Mr. Bernard Schwartz's voice saying, "Mr. Lundy." So teachers, they have an important place. They have a very large impact on our life. We are affected by teachers. Now, James is going to be talking about teachers, and specifically he's going to be talking about Christian teachers. Not secular teachers, but Christian teachers. And teachers are going to be very important. And as we know, we have various parts of the body, and teachers, along with prophets and apostles, are an important part of the body. We see that in 1 Corinthians 12. We also see in Ephesians 4:11, Paul reminds us, and he himself gave some as apostles and some as prophets and some as evangelists and some as pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all reach the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to a measure of the maturity of the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be infants tossed about by waves and carried about by every wind of teaching, by the trickery of people, by craftiness with reference to the scheming of deceit. We also know in Acts 13, verse 1, teachers are placed alongside the prophets there at the church of Antioch, and we know in Romans 12, Paul talks about the various gifts, one being prophecy, which is of teaching. So teaching is an important aspect. And when they're reading this about teachers, they're getting a different visual than that very first visual that we had. that's the teacher visual I have, but they're getting a different visual, and it's going to be important that we recognize that as we continue on. Because the people that were teachers in early Christian, in that early time period, it was a position of highness. It was something to want to be. We didn't have to have campaigns to try to make people be teachers in the early church period. This was something that everybody wanted to be. And because so many people aspired to be teachers, there was going to be a crowding of the ministry. And it was probably, and what we're reading from James, it's probably for the wrong reasons. And for this reason, James is going to warn about the serious responsibilities as well as the consequences of being a teacher. Now, as we start chapter 3, scholars are pretty... if you remember in chapter 2, scholars are pretty set, and they recognize that there's 2 segments in chapter 2. Now, in chapter 3, there's a lot of disagreement. Is there one segment? Is there a couple of segments? Is it a segment that's going to continue into chapter 4? Some will break it up in the first 13 verses, and then the last few verses to verse 18, and some will extend it into chapter 4, going into verse 10, or another group will put it into verse 12. But it's important just to recognize where we started and where we're going. We started with an idea of what faith looks like, and now we're going to go into what wisdom, and more specifically, what being wise in the Christian community looks like, what it entails. And it also, this disagreement reflects something else that I think you've probably noticed if you've read this thing through a few times. All of these arguments and all these positions James is putting out there, there's a lot of them, and they tend to build upon themselves, and sometimes it's difficult to see where one ends and where one begins. So there's a lot to James. I hope everybody definitely is seeing that at this point. There's a lot to this book. So James' first argument that we've read in the first 2 chapters, again, is of faith, and now his second argument will be wisdom and what it means to be a mature person within the Christian community, being a wise one. Now, the connection of faith and wisdom first appears back in that first chapter of James in verses 5 through 6. Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask for it from God, who gives to all without reservation and not reproaching, and it will be given to him. But let him ask for it in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea driven by the wind and tossed about. So James is going to counsel that those who lack wisdom, they need to ask for it in faith. And moving that step in the direction of wisdom, it's going to be saying, James is saying we need to be asking for the right kind of wisdom, which we're going to see. He's going to identify a right and a wrong, 2 basic types of wisdom later in the chapter. But he's going to create what is known as a foil, a contrasting object. And his foil for this chapter will be the teacher. The contrasting object is the teacher, and it's a flawed human example that he's going to draw out for the lesson for those hearing this message. And specifically, it's those teachers that stumble in speech. Now, I know as I said that, many of you were thinking to yourself, boy, Jerry stumbles in his speech a lot. And it's true. It's true. But it's also very important as you read this text to see James is putting himself in this category, because in this he starts, for you know that we who teach shall be judged with greater strictness. James is going to show that the office of teacher is not something everyone should be seeking. Not necessarily it's something we shouldn't be seeking out of the office itself, but because of how important the office is, it shouldn't be something that we want for bad reasons. And that's going to be the main crux of the not wanting to become a teacher, not some of the reasons that get stated by those that use it as an excuse. So first, I think it's important to see that words are going to be loosely connected to that the first two chapters, in that words can be works. R.F.G. Tasker, who is a professor of New Testament exegesis at the University of London, he states this. He said, words are also works, and specifically, they're significant works. In saying that has probably influenced James's argument in his second chapter, verses 14 through 26. Jesus also tells us how important the words are. In Mark's book, or Mark's letter, he'll state, Jesus' teaching, either make the tree good and its fruit is good, or make the tree bad and its fruit is bad. For the tree is known by its fruit, offspring of vipers. How are you able to say good things when you are evil? For from the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person from his good treasury brings out good things, and the evil person from his evil treasury brings out evil things. But I tell you that every worthless word that they speak, people will give an account for it on the day of judgment. For by your words you will be vindicated, and by your words you will be condemned. So this is an eschatological judgment that Jesus is placing on words. And it's an important aspect that we remember as we read James. And in fact, I think 2 or 3 of the things that we've already read from other places in Paul's letters or in Jesus' own teachings, you're going to see those exact same things in this chapter. Very close parallels. So moving from the importance of this work that we talked about last week, it's crucial to understand that human speech would, as a work itself, be a natural progression for James' discussion here. So James is going to move to this idea that the problem of the tongue and the control of the tongue is going to be a very important aspect, probably relating back to what he described as true religion back in the first chapter. So verse 1 is going to raise a question right from the beginning. Why is James making a warning about sinful speech? And why does James single out the teacher as that contrasting agent? And there's 2 basic answers that are commonly given. First of all, there are those commentators that believe that this chapter is about teachers. I don't believe that's the case, and I think we'll see why as we continue. There's some commentators that will not ignore the role of teacher, but then believe that what he's talking about is going to be a general statement about the tongue and how it impacts the Christian. And James is just using this teacher aspect as a jumping off point or a starting place. And then others others think that this reference just sets the direction for the passage. But no matter which it is, we can see that the problem of the human speech, he's going to argue, is definitely going to be related to teachers and Christian leaders. But I think, as we will see, it's not just Christian teachers and leaders that he's referencing. The illustration James uses is going to be blessing and cursing. And while that it probably has a worship setting in view, it also will have a bigger implication. So James has an obvious concern about this application when it comes to teachers and Christian leaders, but as you can see, he's not just talking to teachers as he starts this. He's talking to everybody that might aspire to be a teacher. So it's clear that if it was just the Christian teachers and leaders that he had in mind, he would be talking directly to them and making this very pointed and directed. And instead, he does leave it to all of those that might be wanting to be a Christian teacher. So the general address to the readers in 4.1 and 4.11 is going to demonstrate some sinful speech and some critical speech that will relate to leaders, and we'll talk about that next week. But there's very little indication here in these first 12 verses, especially 2 through 12, that James is only going to be talking to and giving an admonition to teachers and leaders. So it's a general warning about the tongue that we're reading about through this section, and we can all take note of that. But the teaching office was an office of honor, as I mentioned. It had responsibility, it had accountability, it still does, and the consequence he's warning of is those that teach will be under greater and closer scrutiny, both by God and by those that are in the audience. And we all know that, right? We all know that. We've all criticized the guy up here. Throw the word leader on it, and they've been criticized. I know I have. And we're going to read in the second part of the chapter what's wrong with that. Now, we see in this first verse something important, I think. In the Greek, there's a participle that's saying knowing that. So when we read him saying we know that, knowing that, it's often introducing something that it was of common knowledge. It means something like knowing as you already do, or you may be certain that. Remember that, for you are well aware of that. Or my favorite, in fact. I say in fact a lot. So these things are going to be very important. They recognize this. They already understand that teachers are under heavier scrutiny, under heavy judgment. This is something that was not a new teaching to them. This was not new. It was something that they knew in fact. So another aspect about the teachers that I think is important for us to discuss is teachers were like performers. They were textual performers. They were what one commentarian called a text broker. They might have obtained their status not just by academic or by other objective means, but they might have been given the status through some patrimony or some connection, who do you know kind of situation. I guess it's no different now, but there's also a likelihood that this status was won somehow through some public demonstration. Now, if you remember, we've talked about in previous classes that a lot of times Greek teachers would be challenged by their students, and it was a way of promoting yourself to challenge your teacher in debate. So it was a very common thing, and in some of the classes that I've been taking, I've read about some of the philosophers and some of the theologians that actually created their entire school of thought by challenging their own teacher, by belittling, by demeaning, by showing how much smarter than they are than their teacher. So all of this is playing into what James is talking about. And according to Greg Snyder's work, Greg Snyder's work, Teachers and Texts in the Ancient World, Philosophers, Jews, and Christians, he's going to say this about teachers. To speak publicly was to perform, and technical aspects of speaking, including both voice and posture, were measures by which an audience might judge a speaker. Pronunciation, correct word formation, and tone of voice appropriate to the subject matter all were crucial to a speaker's success. Comprehensive control of one's subject matter was also of utmost importance. So when James is going to be speaking about those that stumble in speech, that means something very specific to the readers, to the audience. When he speaks about this, he's invoking this public performance or this verbal command of the law, rather than our bookish or our professor-style idea of school teachers. It's a public nature. It's a performance. And of that, strict judgment is what James is referencing. The judgment comes not only from God, but also from the audience, as I already stated. So it's an honor to be a teacher and a sage, and every line, every word, everything that comes from his mouth is judged. So the danger of the teachers in James's community is going to be an uncontrolled tongue. To James, the tongue is a member of the body that is most difficult to control. The complete or mature teacher is capable of controlling it in verse 2. And James is going to value the completion of maturity very, very highly. The characteristics of maturity is in relation to the knowledge of the Scriptures. An aspiring teacher would often be thwarted in these debates by their students by not having a mastery or a wisdom of what they're saying. They would not be able to withstand the arguments. Basically, in James, the uncontrolled tongue is the antithesis of wisdom. So this is an extremely important aspect of what James is representing here. The tongue represents the world of injustice within his community. In James 4, again, we're going to talk about the world, the cosmos. And James is going to warn those about befriending the world. And we're going to have a lot of discussion next week about that. And the tongue is this cosmic instrument of destruction. It can be the world's friend, and it's able, like a ship's rudder, to steer our bodies, and like a small flame, to set an entire forest ablaze, according to verses 4 and 5. So James is saying the tongue has power, and it sets ablaze even the wheel of existence. And it is intriguing that he chooses the euphemism for hell, Gehenna, for where the power is driven. He sets ablaze the existence itself and derives its power from Gehenna in verse 6. So far, James is simply making an emotionally descriptive case about the power of the tongue and attributing the power to evil forces. However, in verse 7, he's going to explain clearly that the power to discredit wise, well-practiced orators like the teachers of James' day is a possibility. And at stake for James is that the tongue of even the wisest person or the most gifted teacher is capable of cursing. So even if you are wise, even if you are a proper teacher, it can still speak poorly. It can still curse other human beings made in the divine image, while at the same time blessing the image of which they were made. So and let's put this in today's terms. While speaking highly of God, while praising God, while glorifying God, the tongue can still curse, criticize other human beings, which were made in the same appearance as God. For James, this is going to go against the very laws of nature and this wheel of existence. For all other natural objects act according to the kind. James is going to put it, surely a spring out of the same opening does not pour forth sweet and bitter, does it? Surely a fig tree is not able, my sister and brothers, to bear olives or grapevines or figs, nor can salt water create sweet water. So he's saying the Christian tongue isn't going to sound like the tongue of the world. It's so important for us to recognize that. The tongue can't act contrary to its nature. And a Christian nature is different than the world's nature. As a member of the body, it's able to bring forth either blessing and cursing, sweet and bitter. It is unable to be controlled except by a complete, mature teacher. So it's important to understand where this maturity comes from. And he's going to talk about how it's human deeds and their sources within the heart that will transcend this source of good and evil from which these various deeds are going to start or emanate. So the two chief categories that he's going to reference, the tongue is either a friend of God or it's a friend of the world. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Abolition of Man. Actually, it's a compilation of radio interviews regarding the school system in England. So it's been made into a book, and it's a fascinating book. It's a hard read. I'm a skimmer, and I often miss things just out of the nature of the way I read. But trying to skim that it was a skim it 5 times and then read it fully kind of book. but fantastic book. And the point that he makes through this book is there is an objective. It's not all subjective like the world. It's not relative like the world wants to make it. We have some objective truths and standards by which God has provided, and we can't rely on ourselves to make that up. And the world around us, that's what the world around us wants to do. They want to make it up. You do you, I think, is a very common phrase. Well, when we speak of James's terms, you doing you is the tongue basically showing that it's a friend of the world and not a friend of God. James 3 verses 13 through 18 is going to show there's two different wisdoms. Now, Greek has two words which we with our English is equivalent of good. One is agathos, which means intrinsically good, possessing the quality of goodness. But the word James is going to use is kalos, which is lovely. What he speaks of is the loveliness of goodness, the attractiveness of a good life, its wholesomeness and helpfulness as seen by God's people, by the Christians, by the Lord's people. A way of life whose goodness is plain for everybody to see. It's not something that you just see while sitting in a building. It's something that you see on the job site. It's something that you see in the schoolyard. It's something that you see at the ball field. It's something that you see because it's you. I liken this to the situation that I spoke of when we were talking in Acts about church attendance and what makes you a Christian and what doesn't make you a Christian. What makes you a Christian is not like, in the law practice, I use this analogy back in Acts, but in the law practice, we have some simple rules, except for in the summertime, and that is when you attend court, you have to wear a jacket and you have to wear a tie. So much so that when I started out, some of the judges would have really funny, crazy-looking ties to make attorneys wear if they forgot one. But that is a rule that we had to show those in the courthouse who we were. That's what it was. But it was not the coat and the tie that made me an attorney. James is saying that it is what is coming out of our hearts, what is us, what makes us Christian is not the things that, it's not the rules. It's not just abiding by rules. It's about the life we live. And it's so important for us to get this clear understanding of what he's talking about. And where we get this is from the Scriptures. He's going to talk about this understanding. The Old Testament understanding is what made a mature Christian. That was the Scriptures they had. So understanding the Scriptures, it's the fear of the Lord in Proverbs 1. We need to be clear going forward that that's not a thoughtful recommendation. You know, understanding what the Scriptures say is not just a recommendation. It's not a just pick and choose. Proverbs 2 and 5, verse 5, and Proverbs 9, verse 10, they combine this fear and knowledge and understanding or discernment and wisdom together and show that this is inseparable. This is what maturity is. That's Christian maturity. Our fear then of proper reverence for the one who made us, the one that shows us who we are, that is the proper maturity of knowledge, not human knowledge. There's no amount of letters behind a person's name that can make you a Christian. And unfortunately, we place a lot of emphasis on those letters, as evidenced by the fact that I always let you know anybody I'm quoting, where they're coming from, who they are, what's their status in this world. Point isn't what's in this world. The point is the emphasis that our life demonstrates the Scriptures, Jesus' teachings. Catching the Old Testament emphasis of wisdom and this responsibility goes beyond knowing it. it goes to seeking it and continually seeking it, daily, making it a center of our being, to live it, to live it on our sleeve, to live it on our tie, live it on the coat, to live it, not just wear it. So verses 13 through 14 is this encouragement to continue to understand. This description of wise must be understood in this discussion of the Old Testament wisdom, the wisdom of deeds, understanding of the knowledge, and how it reshapes our life. James doesn't tell us anything that we must actually do or any course of conduct to follow in these verses, but he is going to offer us this ethic that we need to be aware of and make a major part of our life. Wisdom's going to come from meekness. And to better understand that, meekness, I think the statement is in a wisdom which always bears the mark of meekness. But meekness is a word that's going to mean self-subduing gentleness, both Godward and manward. Now, this is not what meekness meant to them at this time. So when the non-Christian is reading the word meekness, they're not getting a positive connotation here. This is not something that they would want to live just out of their natural daily life. They would see this as abject or servile. Meekness meaning weak. Epictetus names it as one of the first of the moral faults. So this is something that is a mark of wisdom according to James and a mark of weakness according to that time period. Matthew 11 verse 29, take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Jesus says, I am meek. I am meek, which was one of the reasons why the people of the world at that time did not want to follow Jesus. He was not portraying the idea that they had of a Messiah, of a leader. He was not emanating those characteristics that the world set as what's important. So meekness is a word which requires the context and the relationship and how it will fully shape our lives. James, in verse 14, James makes it very clear that there's a connection with the conclusion of his passage on the tongue. He's going to refer to the heart, which needs to be purged of several things. And I think we can all relate. We must purge our heart of jealousy and self-ambition. And he's going to use the same adjective here, which translated as bitter and appeared back in verse 11. And it's a word that means backish or salty. These are things that we recognize is a negative. If we let these things dwell in our hearts, it's going to create this attitude. And the evidence of jealousy and self-ambition shows this bad relationship and attitude towards others. It's a self-interest attitude that it's demonstrating. And it creates a divisive attitude towards others. And it shows the truth of our hearts. It's demonstrating who we are and what life we're living. So the word translated jealousy really means more than a strong feeling. So it's not necessarily what we think of as being something where we're hostile, envy, wanting what other people's have. It's really implying this idea of a strong feeling. Plainly, it's an adjective meaning bitter. It must have a bad meaning, or adding the word bitter is showing that it has a bad meaning. So there are those who are ready and willing to give up their Christian attitude, their Christian lifestyle, or the things that are supposed to emanate from us for their self-interest, their self-rights, for those things that make them feel good. And it's a sad statement that James is portraying here, that we must put our Christian life and our Christian wisdom above even our rights. In a country like the United States, we talk a lot about our rights. And how many times do our rights interfere with our being a Christian? I had a political science degree in college. I was very political. And I have to say, a lot of times, the idea of my civic duty contrasted with my Christian life. Now, you might think that that's a paradox, because there's a lot of political people. And I'm not saying there's anything about civic duty that's necessarily bad. But what I am going to say is that when we put it first, and when we let it influence the way we appear to the people around us before our Christian attitude, our Christian coat and tie, then we have a problem. And I would venture to say that if we look at our social medias, if we look at if we look at the way we handle, especially during political time periods, how we act, how many people are we going to draw to Christ in the words that we use, in the actions that we take? I'm not as political anymore because I know where I fit in that spectrum when I was. And that is something that I would offer as self-reflection and not something that I would put on to anybody else. I definitely would offer that for our own self-reflections. But the sharpness of self-interest is easily going to lead to a formation of parties. And when I mean parties, I mean cliques. It's us, it's them. It's a force that is going to produce selfish ambition, and it's unworthy of the idea of God's wisdom. It's divisive. It's the undercurrents, even in the institution of a church, in the corporate aspects of the church. It's divisiveness, it's undercurrents. It's these things that are of the world. Now, we have to make a choice. In verses 15 through 17, we're going to come to the central issue, what James has in mind here at this second segment of the chapter. And we need to find our source, our pure source that he discussed back in, he implied back in verse 12. And he's going to outline these basic positions of wisdom, working through the gentleness, being productive of life, of lovingly showing goodness. There's a contrast to the other that I just mentioned, this defensive self-concern that leads to divisiveness. And he's going to identify the wisdom that's prompting our life. What is the wisdom that prompts our life? What are the characteristics that manifest them and bear fruit? And James is going to require us to affirm whatever is displaying. Is it the sharp? Is it the antagonistic? Is it the self-concern? Is it the self-pity? Is it the I'm the only one that's right in the room? Is it those things that are issues of disorder? Or is it something that comes from above? And verse 17 is going to climax his second argument. And it's interesting because we don't get some of the We miss a lot of the poetic power and some of the word craft that James uses because of the translation. But in verse 17, James creates a list that if we read it out loud, there's 9 words of the list that's going to start either with the Greek letter alpha or the Greek letter eta. 2 vowels that are fairly close in sound. Some of these words rhyme 3 or more in a row. So this is a rhetorical technique known as epiphora, and it's a characteristic of expression. It's like a trope of Hellenistic rhetoric. So it's something that would be found delightful when listening to it, and for most people. And he's going to highlight in this first group of characteristics of wisdom and purity. The word for pure here is hagnos, and it signifies a ritual purity, and it's going to be a moral purity, which is in the similar method that Mark's showing the teaching that I mentioned earlier. You can't envy, you can't have strife emit from your heart if you're going to be wise. And if it's emitting from your heart, it's coming from your tongue, it's coming from your mouth. And he's going to highlight this purity. He's going to highlight peaceableness of the wise ones, those that make peace, and they want to encourage justice in their community. Less obvious to the English readers, there's the idea that these lists that he's created are broken by words that don't fit those same, the eta or the alpha. And the words that break them up are full and fruits. So the words that break up this epiphora are full and fruits, underscoring that he's demonstrating what is going to demonstrate one wisdom over the other wisdom. And it's a fascinating thing that we kind of miss because of the way it's translated. But the repetition of fruit, James is going to parallel his arguments from the second chapter in that the community is called to action rather than just speech. And this action must be visible to the communities. And the spirituality is going to be visible and understood as faith, or what he's described as wisdom from above. And that leads us to that last verse. And this last verse, verse 18, is such an important verse. And every point in this chapter has some importance. And it's a lot of great importance. But the significance of verse 18 is apparent in that we see that the two wisdom is going to bring about results. And in the case of the wisdom from above, it is this: the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. There are two ways in which the word harvest, which literally means fruit, of righteousness may be understood. Now, it can mean the fruit which grows out of righteousness, which is righteousness is the seed, which bears the fruit. But we also have to remember the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is the fruit which the Holy Spirit produces. The fruit of repentance is the evidence in our lives that we have been truly repentant. It's the result. It's the emanating result that what grows out of it. And he's talking about the fruit of righteousness. In the same way, the fruit of righteousness is what the fruit of righteousness is going to bear. The harvest refers back to all the good things mentioned back in that verse 17, characterizing the heavenly wisdom. And they all are the proper and natural outgrowth of being with God. Seeking God daily, a natural outgrowth of being wise with the wisdom of God. Now, a seed needs its proper conditions for germination, growth, and fruitage. And James says the conditions must be right. And that is something that we should take to heart. That is something that we should relate to as a body, as a family. Because, in closing, a harmonious fellowship of believers, emanating God's wisdom, is the soil out of which grows a life that is pleasing to God. It is a life that will bring others to God. It's a life that demonstrates Jesus. It's a life that is the light that we're called to be. James 3 is it's a wonderful book, or a wonderful chapter. It's one that I think is misunderstood just because of that first verse, but it's one that I think all of us can relate to because in self-reflection, it's very impactful to each of us. I will look forward to moving to chapter 4 next week, and have a wonderful rest of the day.